The story of America's independence is often told through the great and celebrated battles that defined the Revolution: Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, Saratoga, and Yorktown. These engagements stand as towering moments, etched in both memory and history. Yet hidden within this grand tapestry lies another battle, one so overlooked that it has slipped from most history books. It was not fought by polished regiments with gleaming muskets and drums of war, but by farmers, men who had known the soil more than they had ever known the march. It was a confrontation that pitted 1,000 ordinary people against Britain's elite forces, and though nearly forgotten, it saved the cause of America's freedom. This was the forgotten battle that changed everything, where a handful of determined men rose from obscurity to stand against the might of the empire, and in their defiance, preserved a dream of liberty. The Revolution had always been a contest of wills as much as a contest of arms. Britain believed that superior discipline, firepower, and the sheer weight of its armies would crush resistance before it could truly take root. But rebellion does not live in numbers alone, it thrives in the unshakable spirit of those who refuse to yield. In 1777, after a string of devastating defeats, American morale had plunged to its lowest ebb. Washington's Continental Army was battered, outnumbered, and poorly supplied. Rumors spread that the revolution might collapse altogether. Into this atmosphere of despair, the British launched a campaign that they hoped would divide the colonies, strangle resistance, and end the war in their favor. The British plan was clever, at least in theory. A large force under General Burgoyne would push down from Canada, while other troops moved north from New York City. The two armies would meet near Albany, cutting New England off from the rest of the colonies. With New England isolated, Britain could stamp out the rebellion where it had first begun and deal a mortal blow to the patriot cause. Yet there was a fatal flaw in the plan. It assumed that the local population would be cowed into submission, too frightened or apathetic to rise against the professional might of the British Army. That assumption would prove disastrously wrong. The farmers who would become soldiers were not men who had ever planned to wage war. They were fathers, sons, and brothers, men of the plow rather than the musket. Yet their lives had been shaped by years of hardship on the frontier, where survival required toughness, resourcefulness, and courage. These men knew their land, every ridge, river, and thicket. They had hunted in the forests and tilled the rocky fields. When the news came that British troops were advancing, supported by German mercenaries and loyalist militias, they understood instinctively that their homes and families would be the first to suffer. To do nothing was to surrender everything. So they gathered, at first in small bands, carrying their hunting rifles and whatever weapons they could muster. Word spread through villages and farms that the redcoats were coming, and with it spread the call to arms. There were no uniforms, no drums, no banners to rally under, just determination and the conviction that freedom, once threatened, must be defended by any means. These 1,000 men, hastily assembled and loosely led, became a makeshift militia. To outside observers, they must have looked like little more than a rabble, a collection of ragged men with no chance of standing against the greatest army in the world. But appearances can be deceiving, and these farmers carried with them something the British could not measure: the unbreakable will of a people fighting for their own land. The British, confident in their superiority, moved forward with little fear of serious opposition. Their army was trained in the art of European warfare, lines of soldiers advancing with precision, muskets firing in coordinated volleys, bayonets flashing in deadly charges. Against such discipline, most militias were expected to scatter. But the farmers had no intention of fighting by the British rulebook. Instead, they used the land itself as their ally. They melted into the forests, taking up positions along ridges and behind trees. They understood how to use cover, how to strike quickly and fade away before a counterattack could materialize. What the British saw as wilderness was, to the farmers, home ground that could be turned into a battlefield on their terms. The clash came suddenly and violently. The British columns advanced along narrow roads and trails, burdened with supply wagons and slowed by the terrain. The farmers struck without warning, firing from hidden positions, cutting down officers, targeting supply animals, sowing confusion in the enemy ranks. What had been expected to be an easy march turned into a nightmare of ambushes and relentless harassment. Every step forward came at a price, every bend in the road a potential death trap. The redcoats, trained to fight in open fields, found themselves in a hostile world where discipline gave little advantage against unseen marksmen. The farmers fought with a ferocity born of necessity. They had no reserves to fall back upon, no reinforcements waiting in the wings. Each shot fired was a stand for their families, their homes, and their future. The British, accustomed to obedience from lesser foes, were stunned to find themselves checked again and again by men who seemed to appear out of nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Skirmishes turned into pitched fights, and before long, the British campaign was slowed to a crawl. Time was no longer on their side. The cost to the British was far greater than they had anticipated. Casualties mounted, supplies dwindled, and morale faltered. Worse still, the failure to crush these militias emboldened the broader American resistance. News of the farmers' defiance spread rapidly, carried on the lips of travelers and in the pages of colonial newspapers. The message was clear: the British were not invincible, and ordinary Americans could stand against them and prevail. This was not a battle won by generals or professional soldiers but by the people themselves, and its impact was enormous. The farmers did not win by annihilating the British Army. They won by breaking its momentum, by proving that no march through America would ever be easy. They bought time that Washington desperately needed to reorganize his army, time that allowed the revolution to breathe when it might otherwise have suffocated. The British plan to divide the colonies unraveled, and with it, their chance at an early and decisive victory. In the months that followed, Burgoyne's campaign would collapse entirely at Saratoga, a turning point that brought France into the war on America's side. That great triumph might never have been possible without the stubborn resistance of 1,000 farmers who refused to yield. What makes this battle so forgotten is not its insignificance but its anonymity. It lacked the grand spectacle of larger battles, the famous names of leading generals, or the sweeping maneuvers that attract historians' attention. It was a fight of common men in an uncommon moment, overshadowed by the larger narrative of the war. Yet its importance lies precisely in that ordinariness. It was proof that America's independence was not solely the work of its leaders but the collective stand of its people. Imagine the scene after the fighting quieted. The farmers, exhausted, faces streaked with sweat and gunpowder, stood among the woods and fields they had defended. They were not professional soldiers and never wished to be. Many would return to their farms, to plow their fields again, to tend their livestock, to live their lives in peace. But for a brief moment, they had held the fate of a nation in their hands, and they had not faltered. The British could not understand the depth of what they faced. To them, this was a colonial rebellion to be crushed with force. To the farmers, it was survival, identity, and principle. No army, no matter how disciplined, could easily extinguish that fire. This forgotten battle revealed the true nature of the revolution. It was not simply a war between armies but a war of people defending their own destiny. In later years, when America had secured its independence, the names of generals were celebrated, statues were raised, and battles were commemorated. But the memory of these 1,000 farmers faded into obscurity, their sacrifice absorbed into the broader tide of history. Yet the truth remains. Without their courage, the revolution might have ended in failure, and the dream of the United States might never have been born. To walk today upon the fields where they stood is to walk on sacred ground, though most would not know it. The trees have grown back, the land has changed, and the memory has dimmed. But the spirit of that battle endures in the very foundation of the nation it helped to save. America was not built solely on declarations or victories in grand battles, but on the determination of ordinary people who, when history called, rose to meet it with unshakable resolve. The forgotten battle that saved America is not merely a footnote in the Revolution, it is a reminder of what gives freedom its strength. It is not granted by kings, nor secured by treaties alone, but forged in the hearts of those willing to defend it at any cost. 1,000 farmers once stood against the greatest army of their age, and by doing so, they ensured that generations yet unborn would inherit a land of liberty. That is their legacy, and though forgotten by many, it will never truly fade. The story stretches far beyond tactics and strategies, it is about humanity itself. These farmers were not heroes by design. They were men who woke up one morning expecting to live ordinary lives, only to find themselves thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it, and these men embodied that truth. They had every reason to flee, to bow before the overwhelming might of the empire, yet they did not. In their decision to fight, they changed the trajectory of history. When historians look at the revolution, they see patterns, political shifts, and the movements of armies. But hidden within those movements are the stories of people like these farmers, whose collective actions gave shape to events far greater than themselves. Their anonymity is both tragic and beautiful. Tragic because they deserve remembrance, beautiful because their sacrifice reflects the essence of democracy itself. That greatness is not reserved for a few but can rise from anyone, anywhere, when freedom is at stake. So the forgotten battle is remembered not just as an episode in the revolution but as a symbol. It represents the power of ordinary people, the resilience of communities, and the truth that liberty is sustained not only by leaders but by those who stand behind them. The 1,000 farmers who defied Britain's elite army did not fight for glory, recognition, or wealth. They fought for something far simpler and far more profound: the right to live free on the land they called their own. In the end, that is the story of America itself. By the midpoint of the Revolutionary War, the American cause was hanging by a thread. Washington's Continental Army had suffered defeat after defeat, often retreating in disarray and struggling with shortages of food, ammunition, and even shoes. Many colonists doubted whether independence was even possible, and loyalist voices grew louder, urging reconciliation with Britain. At the same time, Britain devised a bold plan to cut the rebellion off at its roots. By severing New England from the middle and southern colonies, they hoped to choke off the Revolution's birthplace and demoralize the rest of the colonies into submission. It was a moment of crisis. If Britain's plan succeeded, the Revolution could have ended in 1777. It was in this desperate atmosphere that a group of ordinary farmers would rise, stepping into history with nothing but courage and the will to defend their homes. The British were confident that their strategy would end the war quickly. General John Burgoyne was ordered to march south from Canada with a large, well-equipped force, while another army advanced north from New York City. The goal was to meet near Albany, cutting off New England, the hotbed of rebellion, from the rest of the colonies. Burgoyne's army was no ordinary force. It included seasoned British regulars, disciplined German mercenaries known as Hessians, and loyalist fighters eager to punish the rebels. The British expected that local populations would either submit quietly or offer little more than token resistance. To them, the colonists were an untrained rabble, incapable of standing against the world's most powerful military. But what the British failed to grasp was the sheer determination of people defending their own soil. That miscalculation would prove costly when they ran into 1,000 farmers unwilling to yield. When word spread that the British were advancing, farmers from surrounding villages and countryside began to gather. These were not soldiers by trade. They were men who lived by the plow, the axe, and the hunting rifle. But the stakes were clear. If the British succeeded, their homes could be burned, their families scattered, and their dream of liberty extinguished. The call to arms was not a formal muster from Congress or Washington. It was a spontaneous response from people unwilling to stand by while tyranny marched upon them. Messages were carried from town to town, urging men to bring what weapons they had and meet near the expected line of advance. Within days, around 1,000 men assembled. Though they lacked the polish of professional troops, they carried with them something more important: unity of purpose. They would not fight for glory or wages, but for survival and freedom. Unlike Britain's redcoats, these men had no standard uniforms, no bayonets gleaming under the sun, and no organized supply chain. Some carried muskets inherited from fathers or grandfathers, others carried hunting rifles, and still others arrived with little more than axes, knives, or improvised weapons. Ammunition was scarce, forcing them to conserve each shot. Their leadership was informal, sometimes chosen on the spot by local communities, and many of them had never drilled in military formations. To a casual observer, this army would have looked like little more than a ragtag gathering of farmers. But appearances were deceptive. These men knew the forests, the ridges, and the winding streams of their homeland. They knew how to stalk deer through the woods and how to live off the land. What they lacked in discipline and training, they more than made up for in adaptability, resourcefulness, and the sheer will to fight. The farmers quickly realized that facing Britain's professional soldiers in traditional battlefield lines would lead to disaster. So they chose another way. Drawing from frontier experience, they adopted guerrilla-style tactics, fighting the British on terms the redcoats were ill-prepared for. They ambushed columns along narrow trails, firing from behind trees and rocks, then disappearing into the woods before the enemy could respond. They used their knowledge of terrain to block roads, destroy bridges, and harass supply convoys. They avoided large-scale confrontations, instead delivering quick, punishing strikes that bled the British forces of men, morale, and time. Their hunting rifles, though slower to reload than muskets, were more accurate at long distances, allowing them to pick off officers and disrupt enemy formations. These tactics frustrated the British, who were trained to fight in ordered ranks on open ground, not against an unseen enemy who melted back into the wilderness after every attack. The moment came when the British columns, burdened with supply wagons and slowed by rough terrain, entered hostile ground. Suddenly, shots rang out from the woods. Redcoats fell as the farmers struck with precision. Confusion rippled through the ranks as officers struggled to form lines in dense terrain where discipline mattered little. Each advance was met with relentless harassment, volleys from hidden positions, sudden ambushes, and swift retreats before the British could mount a counterattack. What was meant to be a steady march turned into a grinding slog, every step forward contested by determined locals. The clash was not a single grand engagement but a series of running fights that drained the enemy's strength. For the farmers, every hour of resistance was a victory, each skirmish a message to the Empire. America would not be conquered easily. Though vastly outmatched, they turned the wilderness into a weapon. Beyond the physical toll, the battle struck at the psyche of both sides. For the British, it was shocking to see untrained men, mere farmers, stand their ground against the world's most disciplined army. Every ambush undermined their aura of invincibility, sowing frustration and doubt among soldiers who had expected an easy campaign. For the Americans, the psychological impact was the opposite. News spread rapidly through towns and villages that ordinary people had resisted Britain's finest troops and lived to tell the tale. This was more than a military skirmish. It was proof that the revolution was not hopeless, that the enemy could be fought and slowed, even by those without formal training. Morale, so fragile after months of defeat, began to rise again. The farmers had done more than delay an army, they had given hope to a cause that desperately needed it, breathing new life into the fight for independence. One of the most important outcomes of the battle was time. By disrupting the British march, the farmers bought precious days and weeks for the Continental Army. Washington's forces were regrouping, resupplying, and trying to recover from earlier losses. Every day the British were delayed was a day the Americans could strengthen their positions and prepare for larger confrontations. The strategic delay also disrupted Britain's grand plan to cut off New England. Their careful coordination unraveled as one army fell behind schedule, unable to link up with others as planned. What had been envisioned as a clean, decisive maneuver turned into a faltering advance bogged down by resistance. The farmers might not have known it at the time, but their defiance reshaped the broader campaign. By forcing the British to fight on unfavorable terms, they denied the Empire the swift victory it needed to crush the rebellion early. The resistance of the farmers directly paved the way for one of the Revolution's most decisive victories, the Battle of Saratoga. General Burgoyne, slowed and weakened by constant harassment, eventually found his army overextended and vulnerable. Instead of linking up with reinforcements, he was forced into a position where American forces, now better organized, could surround and defeat him. The surrender at Saratoga in 1777 shocked the world. It convinced France that the Americans were a serious force worth supporting, leading to an alliance that provided crucial military and financial aid. Without the earlier delays and losses inflicted by local militias, including those 1,000 farmers, the Saratoga victory might never have happened. Thus, what seemed like small-scale resistance in the woods had global consequences. A forgotten battle of farmers became a stepping stone to international recognition and support that turned the revolution from a desperate struggle into a winnable war. Despite their enormous contribution, the farmers never received the same recognition as Washington, Greene, or the other generals whose names grace monuments and textbooks. Their role was overshadowed by larger, more dramatic battles that historians and politicians later celebrated as turning points. After the fighting ended, many of these men simply returned to their farms, resuming lives of quiet labor without fanfare or glory. Few records were kept of their names or deeds, and over time their story faded into obscurity. Yet these were the unsung heroes who, in a moment of crisis, stood up when it mattered most. They were not driven by the prospect of fame or reward but by duty to their families and communities. Their anonymity is both a tragedy and a symbol. a tragedy because they deserve to be remembered, and a symbol because it shows that freedom was won by the many, not the few. The forgotten battle illustrates one of the revolution's central truths. The real strength of America lay not in its generals but in its people. These farmers were proof that freedom could be defended by ordinary citizens, not just trained soldiers. They embodied the idea that a nation belongs to those willing to protect it, regardless of rank or wealth. In their stand, they revealed that liberty is not imposed from above but defended from below. This was the revolution's most radical lesson, that common men, when united by principle, could defy the might of kings and empires. Their battle was not just military resistance, it was a statement about people's power. Even today, their story resonates as a reminder that democracy is built on the courage of ordinary individuals who rise in extraordinary times. They were farmers, yes, but in that moment, they were also the guardians of America's future. Though largely forgotten, the battle left a legacy that shaped America's identity. It showed that the revolution was not solely the work of leaders or armies but the collective effort of citizens. The lesson carried forward into the nation's founding, that government derives its power from the people, and that freedom requires vigilance and sacrifice from all. The farmers' resistance became part of the unwritten history of America's endurance, a story of resilience passed down in spirit even when the details faded. Every future generation that took up arms to defend the nation, from the Civil War to World War II, echoed that same legacy, ordinary people stepping into extraordinary roles when the moment demanded. The forgotten battle may not appear in most textbooks, but its spirit runs through the veins of the country. It reminds Americans that their liberty has always depended on the resolve of common citizens. The stark contrast between the two sides highlights the drama of the battle. On one hand stood Britain's elite troops, disciplined, uniformed, armed with muskets, bayonets, artillery, and supported by logistical planning. On the other stood America's farmers, ragtag, untrained, without uniforms, and often poorly supplied. It seemed an unfair contest, one destined for swift British victory. Yet the reality was different. The British discipline became a liability in unfamiliar terrain, while the farmers' adaptability and knowledge of the land gave them an edge. The redcoats marched in ordered ranks, but the farmers melted into the woods. The British depended on supply lines, but the farmers struck at those lifelines relentlessly. The clash was not just physical but symbolic. Empire versus independence, hierarchy versus equality, professional might versus people's determination. The fact that the farmers held their own against such a force was a stunning achievement, one that inspired resistance everywhere. Perhaps the most immediate consequence of the battle was the surge in morale among the colonists. After months of defeat and despair, they finally had a story of success, proof that Britain's armies could be stopped. Villages that had wavered in their commitment renewed their support for the revolution. Recruits joined militias with fresh confidence, inspired by tales of farmers who had stood their ground. Even Washington's beleaguered army drew strength from the knowledge that ordinary Americans were willing to fight on their own, buying time and striking blows that mattered. The revolution was as much about maintaining morale as winning battles, and this forgotten fight provided exactly the spark needed at a critical time. For the British, meanwhile, morale sagged. Soldiers who had expected an easy campaign found themselves in a war where even farmers in the woods could inflict defeat. The psychological momentum shifted, and it mattered greatly. Despite its significance, the battle slipped into obscurity. Unlike Saratoga or Yorktown, it had no dramatic surrender or treaty to mark its importance. It was a series of skirmishes rather than one grand clash, and its participants left few written records. Historians, drawn to the names of generals and decisive engagements, often overlook the messy, smaller fights that made larger victories possible. Over time, the memory of 1,000 farmers faded into the background of the revolution's grand narrative. Yet its forgotten status makes it no less vital. In fact, its very obscurity speaks to a larger truth, that history is often shaped not by the well-documented actions of the famous but by the countless contributions of the unknown. Remembering this battle restores balance, honoring those whose sacrifices, though unrecorded, saved the revolution at a moment when it could have been lost forever.